Alright, this is 3.2 Quadratics. We are working on part 3 now, and I'm going to show an example of completing the square in order to solve a quadratic equation. So first of all, we have our formula in its proper format, my x squared, and then my x's, and then the constant that stands alone. Okay, so we've got a, b, and c all sorted out there. They're in the right order. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to move my old c over. So I'm going to have x squared plus 12x. And going forward, I'm going to leave a big old space, and then we'll talk about what we're doing. But for the moment, I'm going to just go ahead and say equals negative 40. Alright, at this point now we're going to do some work kind of off to the side. I'm going to take my b, which is 12. I'm going to say 12 divided by 2. That's going to give me 6. And then I have to square the 6 to get 36. So this is what I'm going to add to my formula. I'm going to go ahead and do this in two different colors here. So I've got my x squared plus 12x, and that's going to equal that negative 40. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm adding 36 to both sides. Alright, at this point I can go ahead and factor this nicely. I'm going to have x plus, and then I'm going to have my 6, and I'm going to just do that in red quick, just so we can see it. So that's our 6 squared is going to equal negative 4. Alright, when I've combined those, that becomes a negative 4. I'm going to take my square root of both of those. X plus 6 quantity squared. I'm just going to ignore the fact that we were using red at this point. Hopefully it's pretty clear how that all traveled out. And now I'm going to have x plus 6 is going to equal the square root of negative 4, which is going to be a plus or minus 2i, right? Because remember, this is the same as saying my square root of negative 1 and my square root of 4. Well, square root of 4 is 2, and my square root of negative 1 is I, right? So there's my plus and minus 2i. Now, last step, I'm going to say subtract my 6 to the other side. So I'm going to have 6, it's going to be a negative because I moved it over, plus or minus 2i. Alright? And this is my solution. This is a case of no real solutions. Alright? No real solutions in this case because we have that I going on. Whenever we have a negative under the square root, that's not going to work. Okay? We will not wind up getting a real solution. So, let's go ahead and take a look at the quadratic solution now. This is actually one of the easier things to do. All right. So here is the formula. Here is the quadratic solution. This is if you want to memorize it, there is a song out on YouTube you can look up. I would much rather people understand what's happening than just memorize a formula. But if you are one of those people who prefers formulas, that's fine. Go ahead and do it whichever way works for you. So my formula is going to be x equals minus b plus and minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all over 2a. Now I'm going to point out something here, and this is I think it's kind of cool, is if you take a look, right here is my vertex. That is my vertex formula. That gives me my axis of symmetry, right? And with that axis of symmetry, remember we talked about the fact, what happens if there's You know, if the curve was like this, and we have our vertexes here, right? What do we have? We have two different solutions. Well, this is our, we even just talked about this. Here's our axis of symmetry. We're going to go this distance plus, and that'll be the same distance minus, which is exactly what this is. All right, this is actually why the quadratic solution works. All right, so here I've got a particular equation they want us to work with. So I have an x squared plus 2x minus 3 is going to equal 0. So our a is a 1, our b is a 2, and our c is a negative 3. And it's important that we keep track of the fact that that's a negative 3. Otherwise, we're going to wind up with things being the wrong sign, and it's just going to be bad. So I'm going to go ahead and plug in all of the numbers into the particular places in the formula. And at this point, it becomes just plugging everything into the right place and then doing my arithmetic. So it's going to be a negative, or the opposite of 2, which is a negative 2, plus or minus. Well, 2 squared is going to become a 4. And then I have minus 4 times 1 and negative 3, right? So when I go ahead and take a look at that, multiply the negative 4 and the negative 3 gets me a positive 12. So I have a negative 2 plus or minus, I'm going to have the square root of 16, and that's all over 2. Then we take the square root of that 16, it gives us a 4, and it's going to be both the positive and the negative solution. Then when we go ahead and divide by the 2 everywhere, that is going to give me a negative 1 plus or minus 2. So what does that mean? Negative 1 minus 2 gives me a negative 3, and negative 1 plus 2 gives me a positive 1. All right. So if you notice, this is the same answer that here that we got up above using our, where is it? Up above using our completing of the square, right? So this was our completing of the square here. I did exactly the same thing down below, and I'm going to do that with each of the ones that we've already taken a look at. So here, I'm going to go ahead and do the example for the quadratic solution. I'm going to say my A equals 1, my B equals negative 10, and my C is going to equal 13. All right, so let's go ahead and do this. I'm just literally going to start plugging everything in. So I'm going to have a negative 10 plus or minus the square root of 10 squared minus 4 times 1 times 13 all over 2 times 1. So I'm going to just put a 1 or 2. All right, so that should get me started. So now I have my negative 10, so that's going to be a positive 10, plus or minus the square root of 100, right, because my 10 squared is 100, minus, well, 4 times 13 is going to be minus 52, all over 2. And so here I'm going to have my 10 plus or minus I should say 10 plus or minus the square root of 48, and that's actually pretty long. I could just make that much shorter. Let's do that. So I'm going to have my 48 all over 2. Well, on this one, remember, I'm going to have to take the square root of this beast. I've got a 16 hiding in here. All right? I have a 16 hiding in here. So I've got a 10 plus or minus 4, right, because the square root of 16 is a 4, square root 3. And that's all over 2. I have my 10 divided by 5, that's going to get, or 10 divided by 2 is going to get me a 5, plus or minus 4 divided by 2 is going to be a 2, square root 3. So if you take a look up above, that is exactly the same answer that we got to before. It's that 5 plus or minus 2 square root of 3. And here's our last one, the last one we just did. I'm going to pause this so that I'm not wasting time writing it all out and you guys can just see what happens. Alright, so I've gone ahead and I've plugged in all of my data, or all of my A, B, and C. I had to sort that out, plug everything into the right place. I wind up with negative 12 plus or minus 144, or the square root of 144 minus 160, all over 2. If I go ahead and do that subtraction, I wind up with a negative 16. So I'm going to wind up with a negative 12 plus or minus the square root of 4i, right? Because my negative here tells me I have an I, and my 16 is going to give me the 4. I'm going to divide everything by 4, or by 2. That's going to give me a negative 6 plus or minus 2i, which is exactly the same answer we got up above. So either way will get you the correct solution. I strongly recommend, though, once you find a way that works, go ahead and use it. You're not going to be required to do it both ways, but I would suggest that it's worth at least understanding what's happening and see how these things connect. All right, I'm going to stop here.